G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. I'm Pete Wargent from AllenWargent Property Buyers, and I'm here with Chris Bates from the Alcove. G'day, Chris. How's things?
Look, doing well, Pete. It's another month down, right? It's the end of Feb. Probably sound like I go away every weekend here. We're actually going down to Currawbara Beach, well, Kalala Bay, actually, I think it is, right near there tomorrow with some friends again, which should be exciting. The tail end of summer, planning a trip up to the Goldie, actually, over Easter, so that should be fun as well. What's been keeping you busy?
Went to the football last night, first time in a little while. So the kids have been starved of AFL for a little while. So only a pre-season, but I was so pleased just to get the Guernseys on and go and have a kick around. But like you, I'm on the strong stuff this morning on the coffees because it's a long way back from Ipswich to Sunshine Coast when there's an evening kickoff. So there's a lot of very tired kids around this morning.
Very good. Yeah, Pete and I were just joking pre-air. I thought, hang on a sec, I feel like a coffee. What do I feel like? One. Well, I actually didn't make one, so it was a bit of a funny reality this morning. Kept Pete waiting. But what else has been keeping you busy, Pete? I mean, it's February's an interesting month. I feel like it's when you've got a few weeks of auctions have sort of gone through. I think clearance rates have sort of jumped a bit. I would say the buyer urgency is definitely higher than it was at the tail end of last year. And I think we'll start to see that when we look at the CoreLogic numbers over the coming few months. You'll see a bit of a bounce in prices, I reckon. Not massively, but I definitely think there's a bit more desire to transact. And I think just following a number of people in the industry, they're also saying similar things. But it's all this conversation of when rates are going and how long they're going to stay high. That's still weighing on people's mind, together with just the general cost of living, right? It's just enormous how much everything costs nowadays. And when people are a bit fearful of how they're going to make the budget balance, the last thing they want to do is leverage up into debt that could be expensive. Do you think that's sort of weighing on the market as well, Pete?
Yeah, I think so. There's competing forces for sure. I must admit, Chris, I don't really follow the daily home value index like I used to. There was a real novelty factor when it first came out, but there was always a couple of issues where one was the seasonality. It seemed to drop around May and then bounce back in June. And then there was always this debate about, well, how quickly can a house price sale be reflected in an index? Like, presumably it's going to take time for that property to settle, be recorded and so on. But in any case, I just noticed the home price indices for February have risen everywhere. So Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth all up 0.3%, Melbourne up 0.4%. So I don't really admittedly know enough about the methodology to know whether that reflects what's happened actually in February or whether it's a bit of a lag from earlier. But in any case, I guess by the time this goes to probably on Monday, I guess CoreLogic will get their stats out and they will show prices rising again in February. So I think over the quarter anyway, Melbourne might still be a bit lower, but it changes the narrative, doesn't it? A headline saying house prices on the rise again for 2025. It might just shift the sentiment needle a little bit.
Well, that's lucky that was the reality there, Pete. I was just having a bit of a guess there. It looks like the data is backing that up, which is good. But there's a lot of talk going on right now with developments, inheritance tax, inequality. So the cities have got big problems around housing affordability and rental affordability, and even just the ability to get security and get something to live. A rental crisis is still, there, to be honest. So what else have you been reading, Pete? Any other interesting stories?
Yeah, well, that's there was actually a piece in Fairfax this week by Thomas Walker, who's an economist interested in social equity and inequity. And also I saw Tom, in addition to Tom's article, Scott Phillips of the Motley Fool talking about inheritances. It's an interesting one because I kind of sit across two sides of this fence because being a Brit, we're subject to inheritance tax on over there at 40%, whereas in Australia that just doesn't apply. And I guess it's a very difficult thing for a government to try and introduce. You can just imagine going into this election campaign if one of the parties said, right, we're going to actually try and pump up the budget by introducing an inheritance tax. It would be so unpopular that it would get shot down or they wouldn't be voted in. So how and when it gets phased in Australia is an open question. But look, you guys as mortgage brokers would see this probably more than anybody. There's such a different starting point for somebody who's lucky enough to have a parent gift them a deposit or help them onto the housing ladder versus somebody who's maybe started out maybe as a migrant, or somebody who's come through the university system with no parental assistance or no intergenerational wealth transfer. And it's a very unlevel playing field. And I guess that's one of the reasons I often say to my clients, you really shouldn't compare your journey to somebody else's, because who the heck knows? Like, somebody else might have been gifted $1 million inheritance and you might not, or you just never really know what's going on behind the scenes. And that's why it's important to focus on your own journey and not worry about too much about what everyone else is up to. But I think it's definitely a conversation that's gathering some traction in Australia, and with some merit, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's not just so much, when you're looking to buy, you've got given a bunch of cash from, parents and grandparents and aunties, uncles and brothers and sisters. Money makes money, right? And I think it's definitely people are getting money from family when they're looking to buy. But also, if you think about it, if a family has done quite well out of investing in the past, and whether that's through businesses or property or shares or commercial, whatever it is, that family mentality of family wealth is sort of there, right? And as soon as kids get to an age where maybe they should start thinking about their wealth, the parents take an active role in helping them buy their first home a lot earlier than they probably would, because they'd have to save a deposit, and it's really hard to save a deposit. So it's not just the time when they're looking to buy, they actually get started a lot earlier. And a lot of parents are investing for kids and building nest eggs up to allow them to give money away. And I think that's where the problem really starts to explode, because it starts to time's on their side. They're getting access to properties earlier. Their options are much greater. The knowledge there internally, the confidence to actually do something, the buffers to allow them to start businesses or take career breaks or get educated, etc. So yeah, the money inequality issues are much greater than just helping out a kid with the deposit. It's much deeper than that.
It is, yeah. I think just reflecting on my journey, I guess because I'm from a very large family plus separated parents, I guess I knew at a very young age there was never any inheritance coming my way. But in a strange sort of a way, that kind of helps, because there's a clarity there. It's all going to be on me, basically. I think, so Thomas Walker in the article said that more than 73% of younger people surveyed by them would back an inheritance tax on estates worth more than 1 million Aussie dollars. I guess the reality is that for anyone who owns a house in Sydney and probably Melbourne as well now, would be captured by a tax like that. So, and that's pretty much how it works in United Kingdom. Once you go above the threshold, the government's wiping 40%. So I think, there's always two sides to that argument. A lot of people would say, well, I've paid a lot of tax through my lifetime. Why do I have to be taxed on death as well? Other people would say it's a good way to sort of restore some balance. I don't have a strong view either way on that. I think we often have conversations with our clients about what to do about their own children. I think it's something that Stuart Weems has written about a lot in his blog over the years. Kate Bakos and I talked about it a bit in our own book. And I guess, what was the old Warren Buffett quote about, you should give your kids enough to do anything, but not so much they can do nothing. So you want to try and give them a good incentive. I think from a housing market perspective, a really strong potential way to go about it is using a matching concept. You don't have to gift your kids a deposit, but if they can save $1 and you can match it with $1, it's a good way to get them to buy in. But the reality is, particularly in the eastern suburbs of Sydney and some of those markets, if you've got an intergenerational inheritance, it can dwarf almost everything else in your financial journey. So it's obviously a big issue, and it's only a growing issue.
Yeah, and I think what's driving it is, the kids have been waiting, nicely next to their parents. So when the parents finally living longer, and then they all of a sudden do die, then they get this inheritance, and they're like, hang on a sec, thanks, mum and dad, and but I'm now 70, or I'm now 60, and I'm actually all right financially. It doesn't really help me that much. It would have helped me a lot more when I was, say, 40, on really struggling to get the family budget to balance, and I could have actually done something with the money. And so I do feel that's skipping generations, and people are willing to give it down earlier. Any inheritance tax would just amplify that, right? If people hate paying taxes. If they think, hang on a second, if I die, I'm going to pay tax on this, they will start passing the money down earlier. So all you're going to do is, economics 101 is you'll create a multiplier effect, and you'll find giving down earlier, that'll get leveraged, etc. And so that's one of the I guess the tailwinds, I guess, it's probably that's been holding back the property market is people have just been sitting in their properties. I think also families are saying, well, yeah, I'm giving a lot of money to my kids, but that doesn't mean they're not working. It doesn't mean that I'm sort of clipping their wings and saying, hey, you don't need to work harder and work on your careers. All they're basically saying is that can go into property, which is allowing them to stay close to their grandkids. And a lot of it's tied up in properties with sub-agreements where if they through divorce or if they sell the property, they want their money back. And it's rather a gift. It's kind of like a quasi loan. And we're also seeing parents investing with kids, so taking an actual equity play in the property with the kids rather than gifting, and families helping out with mortgages. They're going, hang on a sec, I know you're leveraged up. I know rates are really high, but I've got a bit of cash right now. I'm getting 6% on my cash in the bank. Why don't I give it to you and you put it in your offset account, and that helps you with your repayments. And so, yeah, it's not just, there's so many levels to this. And I would say that when you look at the wealth in the property market, $11 trillion, and $2.5 trillion of debt, that's $8 trillion plus of equity. When you add in super at $4 trillion and shares on top of that, there's so much wealth that's skewed to the higher end, and a lot of younger people needing it more than ever. And it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out what's happening. And the problem with that is it's the have and have-nots, and the haves can transact today and the have-nots can't. And then ultimately that cycle gets worse. So should we go on to story number 1, Pete? Obviously, this is our 2 cents segment that we do every Sunday at 7 a.m.
Yes, let's do that. I think just to wrap up on the inheritance point, I'll try and dig it out. There's some good articles by Stuart Weems of Pro Solution who just talks about the various different ways in which you might help your kids if you're in a position to do so onto the housing ladder. Because, some of the ways are, they look good on paper, but it can get quite messy later on, particularly if you've got more than one child, for example. And, I always laugh. I remember my in-laws helping out an old lady who's quite infirm, and she said her kids were really squabbling about the inheritance. In my head, I was picturing like teenagers, and then it transpired the kids were like 72, So like, as you said, often the inheritance comes later than people actually need it. And I think in Australia, reverse mortgages haven't been popular. I think they've been penalised from a capital requirements perspective. And I think if there was such a policy to be brought in Australia, in Europe, you've got the 7-year rule, for example, in Britain, where people try and give money away 7 years or more before death. So as you said, it can push the wealth down quicker, but then that money can then be leveraged into the housing market. And so sometimes there's second order effects that you might not have thought about. So let's take a look at the 3 top stories of the week. So as Chris said, we do this once a week on Sunday at 7 a.m. New South Wales and Victoria time. The first story, quite interesting, it popped up in a few of the mainstream media sort of outlets this week, the potential of 30-year mortgages for Australia. So this was an idea that was actually floated by, I think it was Larry Fink of BlackRock, who said, maybe Australia should consider moving to a 30-year mortgage system, or at least the availability of it. So I guess just to do a brief explainer, I mean, typically in the US, if you go for a mortgage, you can actually fix a mortgage for 30 years. But in Australia, and Chris would be the expert here, but typically, most people take out a variable rate mortgage. So if the Reserve Bank moves interest rates up and down, typically your mortgage is going up and down through the cycle as well. But fixed rate mortgages were popular for a time when we had very low mortgage rates, but generally most people are on variable. But also if people do fix, it's typically only for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 years. So in effect, for most of the loan term, you're back on variable rates anyway. So I think there's a few reasons why Australia's system has been different. We don't have the big, deep bond market, for example, that the US does. But I think I've always thought, and there's different research papers on this, but I've always sort of thought that the variable rate mortgages in Australia, to some degree, can be a strength for financial stability. So if you think back to 2007, 8, 9, when the shit was hitting the fan in a lot of parts of the world from a housing market point of view. Australia can just cut interest rates quickly, and it impacts mortgages across the board very, very much sooner than it would for, say, the US, where a lot of people are on 30-year fixed rate mortgages. Now, yeah, I'd say life gets in the way, and a lot of those 30-year mortgages probably only run for 10 years in the US. But nevertheless, I guess the market in Australia is more responsive to changes in interest rates, probably on the way up and on the way down.
Yeah, I definitely think it gives us the ability to, raise interest rates and get a much quicker responsiveness. And I think there was a number of articles around this when we did lift our rates, how they were, I guess, doing their job faster than they are in countries like the US. You've got a huge amount of their property owners on fixed mortgages that when you lift interest rates, you weren't actually lifting their cost of capital, which is their cost of their mortgage. And it wasn't really slowing down their spending, right? And that's what we really want, is that responsiveness to increases or decreases in rates. And that gives it's also good for families. There's no point overpaying on a mortgage for 30 years if rate cuts happen, and vice versa. But I just think that, there is, and this leads into one of our other stories, is there's a bit of pressure here, and particularly as our superannuation industry gets bigger and bigger. I mean, when I remember back in 2013, 14, somewhere around then, was that a usual sort of marketing spin for financial advisors, someone presenting around the growth of the superannuation industry. And, there was all these graphs that it was going to be 3 trillion one day, and it was 1.4 trillion then. And, these are big numbers. It's gone way past that. The super industry is huge right now. And as that gets bigger and bigger, you can't just keep buying Australian equities. They become overpriced. You have to start buying other assets. And that's why they've been going to things like private equity. Now they're going into, say, developments. They're just consistently, particularly funds. You think about Australian super, I don't even know how many hundreds of billions they have now. And so I do think, long-term mortgages and bonds backed by mortgages over the longer term would be a play banks would want to, super funds might want to play in. And I think, as we've got a system there that can sort of support, these funding, I think that we're going to start to see it more and more. There's a real pressure on always tinkering with banks' credit policies to sort of stimulate, growth in our economy.
Yeah, I think, I guess there's a few differences between what happens in the US. I think, the thing in the US, there's this big secondary market. So the lender doesn't necessarily have to hold the mortgage on their books for the whole 30 years. They can effectively package it up. They can sell those loans on to like pension funds or mutuals or insurance companies and so on. I think if it was going to happen in Australia, maybe the government, there's a lot of focus for the housing market on Australia's 3-year government bond yield. We probably need to issue more 30-year mortgages. I'm not sure it's going to happen. I know there is some discussion, though, about the introduction of 40-year loans in Australia, which always gets people angry. I'm somewhat ambivalent about it because most people don't take those longer loans, because why would you? And is it in any case all that different from taking an interest-only mortgage and rolling it over? Probably not. But I think just from a strategy perspective, it would have been great to have 30-year loans if we could have fixed at 2%, but that horse has bolted now and people are paying nearer 6%. So I think typically in Australia most people take the variable rates. I think I remember once I fixed a mortgage probably in about 2006 at some astronomical rate, and of course over the following few years interest rates fell dramatically. So I think it's quite rare for people to beat the system, in inverted commas, with fixed rate mortgages. There was just a window through the pandemic where people did, but most often in Australia people take out the variable rate mortgages. Offset accounts and redraws have been really popular in Australia, but there's different sides to this argument. I personally have always felt that the Australian system is a strength or a feature rather than a bug, but it works somewhat differently in other parts of the world. And maybe sometimes the economy is less responsive to changes in monetary policy because people are keeping their mortgage repayments the same.
I think when 40-year mortgages are inevitable, if I'm honest, and this is and when they do come out, it'll be a couple of lenders which we've already got. All right, we've got UBank and a few others that are offering it. Then when it becomes widespread, I mean, it's in the bank's interest, right? You can see the government would legislate the banks can offer it. All of a sudden, every mortgage will start happening on. I think back in the day, it was 25-year mortgages, then it jumped to 30. I think it's inevitable that everyone will be having 40-year mortgages over the coming years. A lot of people will be in uproar. Listen to me say that. But it's just that's what the system is sort of calling for. And, that'll be a way that people can borrow more money, and that'll allow them to enter the market. The problem you'll have absolutely is 40 years, a lot more interest than 30 years and 20 years. Just because a mortgage is 40 years doesn't mean you have to pay it off over 40 years. I mean, you could still take a 40-year and pay it off over 5, and that makes good sense. Unfortunately, though, it'll be a way for them to encourage credit growth. And absolutely, people will hold debt a lot longer. I mean, the stats are all there. The people have got a lot more debt in their 40s and 50s and going into retirement than they ever have. But I think the psyche of the next generation is not debt is bad if it allows you to buy assets. And so people are getting more and more comfortable holding debt. You look at the past generations of you've got to get your mortgage down to 0. That's not what, say, at 20 or 30, they just don't think it's achievable. So in their mind, if they hold a debt on a property for the long term, as kids get older and they move out of home, there's the ability to downsize. And that net equity is ultimately what they're trying to build rather than having a house paid off. And yeah, sure, you're forced to downsize, but often people don't need those houses and they're happy to live down into an apartment. And so I think people are going to get more and more comfortable with just holding debt for the period and then building that net equity and knowing that debt's just going to always be there. I think a push for interest-only loans is going to come back with full force. I think there was, when I started in 2013, interest-only loans of 15 years were common practice. The same rate as a home loan on principal to interest. It doesn't really make sense, but that was the case. They all went shut down to 5-year interest only, and not getting interest only on homes was really hard. But I think that's just one of the little things they'll wind back, which probably leads us to our next story, Pete, is some of the articles which we sort of, not saying we're Nostradamus, but predicting things. But I think we sort of called that, these things were coming.
Yeah, maybe somebody's listening to the podcast. I think actually on that point, the stats back you up because more people are taking debt into their retirement years now because, this was a discussion we had on podcasts before the pandemic. It's like, well, if you've got a modest mortgage balance and it's getting inflated away, then, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And then, of course, we've seen building costs explode, 40% higher over the past 5 years or thereabouts. And that debt does tend to get inflated away over time. So, the second story that Chris was alluding to there. So, AFR article, the coalition is to slash red tape if it wins the election. There was one sort of outlier poll over the past week by Resolve that looked very shaky for the government. And the election hasn't yet been formally called. It may be that, it might have been called by the time this goes to air, but I suspect the government is waiting until after the Western Australian election on the 8th of March. So, the coalition says if successful, and apparently now favourites with the bookies to win the election, they would loosen home loan rules for banks to encourage more lending as part of a wide-ranging plan. This is a quote, to cut red tape across banking, insurance and financial markets. So we've certainly seen in the US with the change of government, there's been a big sort of wave of deregulation coming with Trump and Musk and so on. I think it's kind of an echo of that. We've really had probably 15 years since the global financial crisis of more and more regulation as it relates to lending and housing markets. So Coalition said it would direct the prudential regulator to find ways to lower the serviceability buffer. So the lending assessment buffer that we've talked about quite a lot on the podcast, we've got a record 3 percentage points buffer at the moment at a time when interest rates are actually going down, as Chris said. So I don't know whether that would apply across the board. Maybe it would be more directed towards first home buyers. And who knows, maybe the incumbent government finds a way to cobble together a minority government or maybe works with a crossbench or something. So it may or may not happen, but the fact it's even being talked about is bringing it now into the conversation, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, there was some talk just the last couple of weeks around not including HEX in sort of first home buyers. We sort of spoke about that. Absolutely the APRA buffers, another thing. There's definitely been more and more tweaks. It's a risk on around self-employed lending and paying salaries. more banks are more flexible around additional income, whether it's overtime or bonuses or commissions or, RSUs, which if you work in the tech industry, like shares, there's banks that are absolutely more and more exceptions going through, I would say, where sometimes you have to fight really hard to get the bank to lend the money. The bank can lend the money, they will right now. So risk on is absolutely with the banks, and there's absolutely pressure behind the scenes in politics to allow them to lend more. There's been very active CEOs of the banks basically saying, this is forcing people out of the market, the haves, have-nots, which links into our first story. The have-nots have got a limited borrowing capacity, prices are higher than what they can afford. You need to relax lending to allow them to enter the market. And so this is just the first step of that deregulation. I think, and it's because it went tightened up really hard since in that 2012 to 2017 boom. I don't think lending's going back to those levels. That was definitely way too relaxed, borrowing 10, 12 times income. But, there was APRA came in really hard on investment lending, interest-only lending, tightening up all the banks' calculators. They went really hard through the Royal Commission on responsible lending and the assessment of expenses and making sure people can. And so they've made those changes. Then APRA stepped in and said, hey, we're going to need to, increase the buffer in case rates go up. But hang on, have we gone too far right now? Do we have to unwind these and start to allow people to borrow more money? And I think that change in 2019/2020 with the Royal Commission was sort of the point where the scales are starting to flip the other way and say, hang on a sec, it's now down to personal accountability. If people want to borrow money and invest, it's up to them. And I think we're moving in that direction versus more and more regulation, reducing lending.
Yeah, so the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor said that a new statement of expectations would be issued to APRA, basically to try and boost competition across the banking sector, get smaller lenders more involved. And I think, yes, financial stability will still be paramount, but we need to, quote, facilitate investment, innovation and competition, not hinder it. So I think, previously there have been calls for APRA, I think it was around October last year, to reduce that lending assessment buffer, and they knocked that back. I think what the coalition is probably angling to work towards is maybe a more flexible buffer through the cycle. I think if interest rates are going up, then maybe the big lending assessment buffer makes sense. But if it's coming back down the other way, people always say, well, what happens if interest rates go up 3%? Well, there's two things there. Firstly, that only happens usually when nominal incomes are also rising dramatically. You don't get interest rates going up, being hiked 12 times in a disinflationary environment. But the other thing is, as well, as we've just seen, just because the mortgage rate has gone, well, the cash rate target has gone from basically 0 to 4.35%. It doesn't automatically mean people are defaulting on mortgages. The assessment buffer is there to make sure people can comfortably afford the repayments, and the system has been much more resilient than people might have expected. So, Chris, let's finish up with this third story of the week. This is one I think you sent across to me, ABC News. Sydney rezoning for more apartments on the North Shore, by the looks of it. So I guess developers are circling now the expectation that there should be some rezoning around some of those train and metro train stations. And I think a number of blocks have already submitted applications to get some tower blocks going in. I mean, this is something I think we even talked about a week ago, isn't it? It seems like an easy win if you could allow people to build up to 10 stories or more directly around the train stations. I guess it always brings its own challenges with more cars and you need more amenities and so on. But I think for both Sydney and Melbourne, this is the way it's going to go. And I think actually our old friend Peter Tulip on social media said this week is that, look, it may be that a rezoning doesn't instantaneously increase supply, but when it becomes feasible to build, then you do get this like burst of development. And we actually saw that in the previous cycle. So I think it kind of makes sense if the population growth running as it has been, that areas around the train stations, key transport links would be obvious areas to allow more development.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very emotional one, this one, right? Particularly when it's going to affect you and your family. And there's always an anti-immigration argument to this, right? That's what a lot of people say down. We've already got too many cars on the road, got too many people, we're full. And and no one else can come here. The reality is, even if you did believe that and wanted that to happen, do you actually think the governments are going to do that? And their incentive is to do that? Absolutely not. And so the system is what it is. And so complaining about that isn't probably going to be the most productive thing. So because the system isn't going to change, I would say. So the first thing is if we are going to see massively growing population over the coming decades, unfortunately, it's really hard to go and create another city and put 5 million people somewhere. And so the reality is we're not going to go and build these new cities. We're probably just going to get bigger cities. Sydney's going to get bigger, Melbourne, Brisbane, and the 1 hour sort of commute from those cities in particular is probably going to piggyback off those capital cities. But 2, 3, 4 hours away from the capital city, you start to have issues. And I think the return to work sort of highlighting that maybe the remote work full time doesn't really work for a lot of jobs and a lot of companies. And so do we end up there one day? Potentially. So ultimately, if our cities are going to get bigger, then we need to start to have some hard conversations on how we're actually going to grow the cities. I think we're getting further and further away. The greenfield estates will absolutely still happen. We will keep expanding further and further, all the way to the mountains, all the way down, and probably cut up all our farms, which is going to create a food problem for us. But ultimately, we're going to be doing that. That's just is what it is. Then we're going to be building apartments. And so absolutely, Melbourne and Brisbane have sort of had some more relaxed planning controls that have allowed them to build more apartments. And so you're going to see high density happening. But I think this missing middle, which is where the New South Wales government sort of released, this is highly emotive because you're moving suburbs that typically were protected because NIMBYs were so powerful. And the government's saying, hang on a sec, I'm going to override the councils and change planning controls around traffic hubs, i.e. train stations, and allow people to build medium density, which is changing the planning codes and not taking the power away from councils. Highly emotive, but it's really brave from Chris Minns to be doing this. And I think it's necessary because you can't just argue that we have high density greenfield estate and keep the rest the same. I think everyone has to play a part in this. But there's also challenges when you add increased density. You've got roads, you've got sewerage, you've got just waste, you've got cars, you've got so many elements, parks, public spaces, schools. If you remember that old game, Sim City, which I'm sure you played back in the day, Pete, it's a bit like that. You've got to really, there's so much more that goes on. And the government makes it and the councils make a bit of money through the development, but they still need to build a lot. And there's capacity restraints for us as a country. And so, but I think what for me is interesting about tracking this story, it's probably another one that I love watching, is it gives you an insight into how our cities are going to have to change and where they're more likely to build properties in the future. So when you're looking to invest in the market, you want to go, look, I want to strategically buy things that will either benefit from that or be protected from that. So I'm not going to buy properties in areas where zoning would change, or I will buy them in there and I'll try to benefit from that zoning change in time. And so, how do you read these stories, Pete?
Yeah, you've made me laugh with your Sim City reference. I think I'm too old. I'm probably more of a Super Mario kind of era. But I mean, in terms of what this means immediately, probably not that much to begin with. Maybe you'll get some neighbours clubbing together to sell their homes in a block sale to developers. But I think maybe if you go a few years down the track, you'll start to see the impact of this around train stations. I mean, yes, there's always competing tensions. If you think about a place like Ku-ring-gai, it's a beautiful city, Sydney. And of course, the locals don't want to see change. I was just driving through the suburbs of Brisbane last night, through Bridgeman Downs, then you go into McDowell. And it's that missing middle that you talk about. Lots of townhouses going. I mean, objectively, it's not good looking stock that we're building in a lot of cases. But I mean, that's the conflicting debate, isn't it? We need more supply. Brisbane's a funny place. You drive through, you go from McMansions, and then next street you've got 25 townhouses that with no yards, and then then there's a block of units and there's an empty shack. It's a strange place, but doesn't seem to be very coherent sometimes. I think when I just sort of observe what people are discussing, there's always this there's some people who are trying to change the system, and there's other people, I guess, like me, who just think, well, you've got to work with the system. I mean, as somebody that spent a lot of my life in Europe, where people have campaigned and they've argued and so on about changing migration policies. It ain't changing because governments are so incentivized to bring in big numbers of people to pump up GDP. Will Australia cut its migration quotas? Probably not. So if that's the case, then we need to build. That's the reality. You can't have it both ways. So I think we'll probably see. Maybe it might take 3 or 5 years, but eventually we'll see a big boom of apartment supply. I think the ABS put out the latest construction work done figures just this week for the December quarter. You can see house building picked up last year in Perth, picked up in Adelaide, southeast Queensland, where the supply is desperately short. But actually, even though the apartment supply seems more mixed, it does seem to be picking up in Sydney and New South Wales now. So maybe that's the nascent signs of the apartment cycle really getting moving in Sydney now. So yeah, that's one to watch over the next 2 or 3 years.
I think you made a really good point there around what we're building. And I think that's where if you want to have an impact, is be really vocal around the quality of stuff that is getting built, and pushing for minimum standards, and tree protection, and really protecting certain parts of suburbs, and wildlife, and etc. So I think you need to put all your energy in and say, hey, we've got a quota and we're going to have to hit this, but I'm not going to be anti it. I'm actually just going to be a bit more vocal on what we're actually building. And I think the government's trying to do pattern book sort of designs, going back from a blast from the past. But the quality of those designs are amazing, and it's some up and coming superstar architects that have built some amazing things that are more affordable, but they're also designed well, and they are visually appealing to people walking past, rather than glass boxes put up as cheap as possible, as quick as possible for investors. And so this is where we're heading. And I think it's just how cities evolve, and I think that'll apply to other cities, particularly as the supply and demand. The other thing I would say is attitudes towards this are shifting. And like I said, a lot of older people are going to debt with retirement with a lot more debt. Well, younger people are becoming more and more understanding that what's good for me, and if it's not good for society, it needs to be sort of balanced. And I think more younger people are getting more and more comfortable with building and densification of our cities, and they've lived in more density versus, say, the older generation who are sort of stuck to status quo and hate change. And I think as years go by, tick, 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 I think you'll see that we start moving more and more into this direction of, yes, in my backyard, but I want to have a key part to play in actually what actually gets built and how it impacts the overall suburb.
Yeah, well, I'll say the other side to that, just where we live in England, we've bought a place over there for when we spend time in the UK. There's a proposal for 200 new houses or so to bring in maybe 500 people. It's a pretty small town where we live, maybe 3,000 or 5,000 people. The Facebook comments, I would say it's like 99% against, but there's not enough amenities. Schools won't go, doctors won't go. I think there's a lot of that still. Like it's like, well, the town needs to grow. If you're going to fill up these empty shops where everyone's been shopping on Amazon, you need cafes and restaurants and hardware stores and things like that. But the pushback is, it's unbelievable. But I guess that's human nature. So just one little observation this week made me chuckle. 2 articles in the Fin Review, 2 days apart, 21st of February. Warren Hogan, RBA rates cut will fuel inflation and prolong the cost of living crisis. 2 days later, Angus Coote, don't believe the doomsayers, more rate cuts are on the way. So I think that's going to be a big part of the discussion over the next year is, the CapEx figures looked a bit disappointing. Is there going to be more monetary easing? Probably nothing before May, you would think. So that's something we'll monitor as the year goes on. But sadly, Chris, there's no inheritance coming my way. So I guess I better get back to work and let you crack on as well.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. So there's nothing coming our way, and and if there is any money coming, I'm encouraging them to spend it, right? Because you only live once. I mean, there's a couple of interesting articles I saw. Warren Hogan is a good guy, by the way, and I do love talking to him. I've spoken to him a number of times on the Elephant, and he's more of the bearish one. He's more the he's very anti. He predicted rates were going to go where they are, in fairness, and he's also saying, hey, don't get these cuts happening too fast. The inflation and the sort of stickiness to it is way more than people are expecting, and so you have to listen to what Warren's saying there. And will it fuel more inflation? That's obviously what it's more likely to do. And so the other interesting article I saw on the AFR was Chris Joy. Hats off to him. Over the years he's done really well, and that he kind of note that the RBA's nominal rate, or where it's I forget the name of it. The cash rate that's neither inflationary or deflationary.
Yeah, the neutral rate.
Yeah, the neutral rate. That's it. But basically, he said that the RBA basically pulled out, pointed out that it's actually not 3.5. It's probably the 2 something.
Could be a high 2 or a 3. Yeah,
that's right. And if that starts to drift lower, as in they get more comfortable with how I guess deflationary higher rates are, then that's another sign that more rate cuts are coming. So I thought that was an interesting point, because if we thought we were going to go from 4.35 to 3.5, well, actually, no. We're actually going to go from 4.35 down to 2.9 if we want to just maintain inflation where it, in the band. That's a big difference. Did you notice that as well, Pete?
Yeah. I mean, this has been a very interesting debate, right? We had very low interest rates in the lead up to the pandemic, and we just couldn't seem to get inflation up to 2%, let alone 2.5%. And I guess that's the big question is, what has changed between 2015 to 2020, where virtually nothing seemed to get the economy moving? Admittedly, governments weren't really helping with the fiscal policy side that much. But what's changed between then and now? Is it demographics? Maybe just inflation expectations got a lift as the money printing took off. But if you look at all those models that the RBA puts out there, maybe the neutral rate's around 3 or maybe even lower. So nobody really knows. And that's it's a bit like traveling towards the horizon. The closer you get to it, it seems to sort of move away. So that'll be a very interesting debate over the next year. It's just the sheer unpredictability of the world at the moment, I think, that makes it tough to call. A lot depends on oil prices and what happens with Ukraine and what happens in the US. So there's a lot of things that are very external to Australia. So definitely one to watch. If you want to have a chat to Chris and the team at the Alcove, we'll put a link in the show notes. And if you're interested in making a property move anytime soon, we're always happy to have a chat as well. There's a link in the notes. I'm Pete Wargent. What's on for the weekend, Chris?
Down Kalala Bay, I think it is. I haven't been there before, but down near Jervis Bay, crisp white sand and beautiful.
Yeah, very white. I remember, and squeaky white sand beaches down there. It's a beautiful part of the country, but.
That's right. And so, we're going away with some friends. One of my mates is French and his family's over from France. And so he's a chef as well, which, good spot to go with good food. What's there to complain about? So I look forward to catching up with you all next week. And
you have to show him a good old Aussie Parmigiana, the finest delicacies of the South Coast. Or maybe a fish restaurant might be more up his street. So.
I think he'll be cooking at home, Pete. That's the benefit of being mates with a chef. So I'll buy it. He can cook it. So anyway, we'll look forward to chatting you all next week, and happy Sunday to everyone.
Sounds great. Have a great weekend, everyone, and see you next time.
See you next time. Bye.
Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.